Greetings, friends! Wanangers here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine War Update for the week of February 16th through February 22nd of 2026. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine War Updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel. We are going to begin in the Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia direction. We're going to continue talking about the Ukrainian counteroffensive here. Now, it does seem like that this counteroffensive is slowing down, but there is still some stuff going on. Let's talk about it. So the war is basically about 4 years old now, and it's a lot of, and I think this war is going to continue going on because the negotiations have not produced anything so far. So I do think we're still going to see the war go on for a little while longer. And in the Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk area, there's been some small changes, but not that much actually has come out. Now, the biggest thing, we got 2 new geolocations coming from this area that could help us determine what's happening. We had another geolocation in the south of Sunsivka of the Ukrainians being bombed here. And then in the northern part of Ternovo, we had a Ukrainian soldier hiding in one of the destroyed buildings here that was getting bombed by drones. So it does show that, yes, the Ukrainians have infiltrated this area. But again, I don't want to repeat myself every week, but I always talk about how the front line is very fluid. It's like a layered cake where where the lines connect, it's not like a very solid front line. They're intermixed. There could still be Russian troops here. There could be Ukrainian troops in Stepova and Ternovo. They're intermixed and so forth. And a lot of the offensives are done in groups of 1 to 3 people, because that's the only way you could try to avoid being attacked by drones, for example. So that is the... And right now, it seems like the Ukrainians have basically are trying to push the Russians out of these kind of gray zone villages, as I called them last week, and are still battling, as I mentioned, for the towns of Berzovo and Vyshana. These are the main, again, as I mentioned, this is the main area the Russians want to hold on to. And it looks like they are still holding on to it, but the Ukrainians are probably trying to infiltrate these areas. But if the Russians could at least drag reserves here and hold on to this area right here, has a river, has some reservoirs. These are 2 pretty decent-sized villages, kind of the biggest in the kind of general area in this area. If they could hold on here and, expel any Ukrainians that come here and force them to go back, then, the Ukrainians won't be in, they're not going to fall back to these, villages here. They'll fall back to their main defenses, which is around Pokrovsky and Velika Milikaivka, because, these are big towns. And there's a river here. So, this is where the main Ukrainian defenses are. And so, these areas around Aleksivka, Nova Alexandrivka, Guy, and Sunsivka, these are going to be more of a gray zone where it would be observation posts. Maybe the Ukrainians, keep 1 or 2 people here, but then they'll be easily driven out if the Russians want to retake them. But again, these villages have been really wiped out. There's not really anything much standing there, and you won't really have much. There's not a solid front line of people holding the lines here. It's just so this is so the main. If the Ukrainians want to have anything from this counteroffensive, they need to take Berezova and Vyshana here, but it looks like that's not happening. But again, they're still trying, and we shall see. And then in the second vector of the Ukrainian attack, it looks like the Ukrainians pushed the Russians out. Some Russians are sort of saying, there's still Russians in Ternovata, that they still have positions in this area here. We don't know. We haven't really gotten much geolocations here. We only got the geolocation of the Ukrainians being in Ternovata and Kosovo. But maybe there's a bunch of trench networks that are along the Gancher River. Maybe the Russians are still there. Who knows? But in any case, there hasn't really been that much changes in this northern part here. We haven't gotten more updates of the Ukrainians have crossed the river and taken Nova Zaporizhia and Dobropillya, for example. We don't know yet. There's probably Ukrainian DRGs that crossed the river because and everything, but again, it's the Russians are still here, are still holding on. So. A week has passed, and it looks like the Russians are still holding on, but the Ukrainians are still pushing, but it looks like the offensive is starting to run out of steam, but again, who knows? Maybe the Russian lines break here, but we shall see. Now, the Russians are in the southern part of Lyman. The Russians are actually making a lot of progress. This week we had the Russians raising their flags in the town of Tesovko. Last week we only had them on the eastern outskirts, but this week we had them raising their flags here, and they have also showed us that there's this trench system around the town of Krishny, but I don't think Krishny is an actual village. I think it's yeah, I don't think there's even anything here. Anyway, well, there is a strong. It doesn't show up on this map, but if you look at the fortification map, there's a giant trench system here. So, I think the Russians showed that they occupied it. So this kind of area up to the rail line here, and, we talked about how they took Zaporizhia, which was really good for the Russians. Now, we don't know if this is just again, these are DRG activity, where the Russians maybe kick the Ukrainians out of here, but there's no real Russian presence, or maybe there's two guys in Star Ukrainka. I would assume in Zaporizhia there's probably a bit more of a stronger presence, but this area is probably right with infiltrations. So, but in any case, if the Russians can't really continue moving westward since the Ukrainians are attacking in the northern sector, they need to reassert control over Ternavata and improve their zone of control here before they could continue pushing west. But if they do, maybe they'll advance towards Voronka Tershi and then use this as a base to accumulate forces, because this is another one of those bigger villages where the Russians could accumulate forces, and then this would not disrupt, but it would make the Ukrainians probably stop trying to push here. From this, relieve pressure on the Russians near Dnipropetrovsk and force them to move south. So we shall see how that develops. And then in the kind of actually more of the Zaporizhia near the western part of Kharkov, this is where we talked about this another area where the Ukrainians started another counteroffensive. However, there's we still don't know the exact. We talked about how the Ukrainians are now contesting the northern part of Primorska again. We talked about they're contesting the Russian push towards these villages here. The Russians claim they took Zapasny and Dnipropetrovsk, for example, but no one really believes that. They think they're pulling shit out of their ass. So a lot of sources are even saying the Ukrainians took back Lukemia. I think we had a geolocation of this, but I'm not sure. But in any case, the Ukrainians are definitely, contesting the Russians from being able to assert control over these villages. But it seems like a lot of sources are saying the Russians are still trying to, infiltrate Lukemia and, Pavlovka and Novokolonovo. But it does. The Russians are being a bit step back here. Now, one of the biggest news that came out of this week is that even from a pro-Russian source, Rybar, saying that the Ukrainians did some sort of big, did a Leroy Jenkins moment where they were driving with a vehicle and used this highway to then enter Plavny, where they disembarked. Now that happened a few days ago in the earlier part of this week, and then we've had no other updates since then. It seems like maybe they got destroyed. Who knows? That's probably what happened. So right now the Russians, after taking Stepanhurst, they thought they could continue expanding their zone of control here. Again, we've been talking about the encirclement of Kharkov, which is one of the prerequisites here. But for at least from the west here, but it looks like, this will definitely be a step back for the Russians to take the encirclement of Kharkov and Zaporizhia in general. But the Ukrainians still have the initiative in Zaporizhia for the most part, but it's definitely it's not as catastrophic as it's looking out to be. But again, anything could happen, but it looks like the Russians are trying to reassert themselves, put in reserves, so we shall see what happens. Now we're going to go to the Dobropillya direction, and this week we actually do have some updates here, unlike last week. One of the biggest updates, well, not even just some small updates. Now, around Radinsky, we've had some multiple geolocations around this area. We had a geolocation of the Russians being right on the outskirts of this mine right here, and then we had a geolocation of the Russians being around this mine here. And some pro-Russian sources are saying the Russians have occupied this mine that's right next to Radinsky, which makes sense. So, obviously this mine right here, which is closer to Ukrainian positions in Sevilia and Shentemko, is still under Ukrainian control. But this mine shaft that's really right next to Radinsky, we don't have an exact geolocation of the Russians being here just yet. So maybe it has not been consolidated yet. But I do think that it's probably also been razed to the ground because of how close Radinsky is, and because the Ukrainians probably used it to infiltrate Radinsky. But we do have a lot of geolocation of the Russians starting to infiltrate these fields to the west of Radinsky. So my guess is they're going to try to consolidate in this mine shaft, in this mine shaft, and so forth. So just a little bit of progress there. A bit more to the south, we had the Russians bombing the northern part of Grishny right here, and even pro-Ukrainian sources are saying that the battles are now going on for the center of Grishny right here. So, we shall see how that, develops. But, yeah, it looks like the southern part is under Russian control. But, the battle for Grishny is still going back and forth. So, lots of battles going on there. But, slow and steady. This is a very tough battle. So, in the more southern part here, the Russians are still moving across this kind of rail line towards the town of Sigirivka here. Moving across this rail line. This not only helps the troops in Grishny as they try to take more and more of these like fields and such, but they're also trying to move towards Sigirivka here just to reach the border here. They've taken more and more taken some more of these tree lines here, taken this giant complex near the Pokrovsk mine shaft here. So just some progress in these fields here, but nothing much. In Dobropillya, we also have it where we actually had a geolocation of the Ukrainians being in this kind of right in this like northern middle central part of Dobropillya. I think it was them like attacking and disembarking here and attacking Russian positions here. So it does show that Ukrainians are actually not only in the northern part, but are still able to attack the Russians in this in Dobropillya. So Dobropillya is still being contested by the Ukrainians. It's not about to fall. So a little bit of good news for the Ukrainians in this area, but still nothing much change. And then the last thing to talk about is in Turetsky, the Russians are still improving. We had another geolocation of the Russians clearing a trench network that was up to the west of Turetsky, around this area right here. So yeah, there's a bunch of trench networks that are like right to the west of Turetsky. So they took one that was a bit more to the north here last week, and this week they took one that's near the south. So yeah, they need to take those just to have areas they could hold, like sit in. Turetsky, a lot of the probably buildings in Turetsky were like bombed out during the war here. So it probably is a good idea to take some of these man-made fortifications so they could like hold on to their northern flank here. So we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Kostyantynivka direction. This week, there's actually not been that much changes. Really, it's actually flipped. Last week, we had a lot of changes of Kostyantynivka and none in Dobropillya. Now we have, it's kind of flipped. In Kostyantynivka, we don't really have that much. The battle, we still, the Russians are still battling for Lymanivka. We had the Russians, actually, we actually have this as a gray zone. Maybe the Russians are infiltrating deeper than I thought. I actually haven't seen this update yet. Anyway, it does, because we had two geolocations of the Russians being on the outskirts of the southern part of Kostyantynivka here, and and so forth. So, but we haven't had any more geolocations since that time during the last week. So we don't know if they've improved that, if they were eliminated, but we shall see. And in this area, the Russians are still battling for the northern part. They're still trying to break into the central part of Kostyantynivka, the north central part, but this area is kind of where the main battles are going on. So and also we talked about the Russians were infiltrating this or taking this forest and taking this area. So still clashes here, but there's been not really that much progress towards the central part of Kostyantynivka this week. So not that much changes here. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Slavyansk direction. And in the Slavyansk direction, we've actually had a lot of good progress this week. This week we had two geolocations, which completely proved that the Russians are in complete control of the town of Minkivka. We had the Russians raising their flags in the central part of Minkivka and in this park right here. A lot of sources, also along with this means they're also clearing these things around the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, and a lot of sources are saying that the Russians are about to take the town of Glubovka. I'm kind of surprised they haven't taken yet, because if they take Minkivka, literally Glubovka is right next to it. It's just a one-way street village. Maybe all the buildings were destroyed and there's nothing to occupy. Who knows? But we had the Russians in Privilia, for example, so it's not like the Ukrainians are able to cock-block the Russians. So I do think Glubovka is about to be taken soon, and but yeah, we have 100% confirmation that Minkivka was taken, and I wouldn't be surprised. So right now the Russians are probably gonna take Glubovka maybe by the end of the month, and then secure their northern flank, the southern flank here of the Slavyansk direction. So very good progress there for the Russians. The battle for Dnipropetrovsk is still ongoing. It looks like the Ukrainians are still trying to hold on to this northern sector right here, but we had another geolocation, I think, of the Russians in the central part of Dnipropetrovsk. This is a pretty decent-sized village, so one of the biggest in the area. And so the Russians are definitely going to use this as a starting off point towards Ray Alexandriivka, which was one of the main goals for this direction. But the Ukrainians are obviously still trying to contest it, but so we shall see how that develops. And then in the northern part here is the Russians are actually making more and more progress towards the town of Krivoluka and Kalinovka. There's a bunch of trenches here. We had, the Russians taking, more and more of this area right here, taking this hill right here. And so, it looks like the Russians are now pushing away from Zakhitna towards Krivoluka and are now battling for this village. But the Ukrainians are still in full control of it, but it looks like the Russians are probably starting battles for this town, and they're probably going to be able to occupy it very soon. If they're able to occupy Krylovka. Now, the thing is, when you're looking at these villages, right, like Kalinovka and Krylovka, if you, want to, zoom in, it's like, oh, it's a pretty small village, maybe they're able to take it. But the thing is, it's not necessarily the village they want to take. There's a bunch of trenches here. Again, the front line, even though they took Seversk, this entire front line up to Slavyansk is just it's like the most fortified area in the entire Ukraine, I would think. Like, everything up to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, this entire area is probably the most fortified area with all the trenches and stuff like that. Now, they're old fortifications. Maybe they're not updated for drone warfare, a lot of these trenches, because, a lot of these things were built in, 2023, 2022, and such, because that's when, the front line's been here since that time. In any case, so they have to go, take stronghold by stronghold and so forth. But again, my main guess is that right now, once the Russians take Dnipropetrovsk and these secure themselves here, they'll continue pushing north here. Maybe take Ferodurovka and move up here. They'll take. Let's actually zoom out here so we can have an idea. Again, the main goal here is to surround Ray Alexandrivka, which is the biggest town in this area. Take something like this. Take something like this. And then they'll take Ray Alexandrivka and pincers and take it. And then from here, I think they'll continue moving up along the canal and along the river to take one of the main goals, which is Mykolaiivka, which has the Slavyansk power plant. And then once they take that, they'll be up along the canal. They'll have the high ground advantage, and then they'll use that to start droning Slavyansk Kramatorsk. But I don't think they're going to continue advancing towards Slavyansk Kramatorsk because of how much fortifications there are there, but we shall see. Alrighty. Now we're going to go to the Lyman direction, and in the Lyman direction, there's been some small changes. I'm still surprised they're not doing a full assault on Lyman. Maybe they're still trying to accumulate the forces to do a big push yet, and maybe they want to move some pieces. But the Russians are definitely, this is like one of the main areas where, because of the progress that they did last year, they have everything in. They've basically most of the prerequisites to take Lyman, but we talked about how they have positions in Lyman, but they've not expanded them just yet. And that hasn't changed yet, but they have expanded on these, the villages around Lyman. For example, this week in Dobropillya, we finally got 2 geolocations. We had one in the eastern part and one in, the southern part of Dobropillya, this area right here. So it looks like the Russians are in this eastern part here and are trying to infiltrate it. So, who knows, maybe this is the beginning of the Russians trying to kick the Ukrainians out of Dobropillya. So we shall see how that, continues. But, so definitely, because once they take Dobropillya, that is, the last kind of, thing, because that taking Dobropillya would definitely cut off Lyman from the north here, because right now the southern part is cut off, and then now they only could go across the river, and then once they take Dobropillya, they'll cut off the north, and then basically the only thing to supply Lyman is through the rivers here. But again, it's very hard to supply Lyman through rivers, so I do think Lyman's going to fall very soon. We had also a geolocation of the Russians being in Svatovsk here, on the very most eastern outskirts here. I forgot the exact geolocation. I think somewhere around this area. But in any case, it does show that DRGs are actively involved. We had a DRG activity in Sontseva here and so forth. So the Russians are very much infiltrating these areas, and it's their advancements around here are very much very advancement, or very, sorry, that made no sense, are very much deep and such. Now, the other thing is a lot of Russians are, before I thought Yarova was under full Russian control, and, because we had a lot of geolocations here, but it seems like even pro-Russian sources are saying that, yes, there's Russian troops in Yarova, but it's one of those intermixed villages where you could have Ukrainians also entering here, and there's, intermixed and all that. So Yarova is, one of those gray zone villages. Not even, a gray zone. There needs to be a new word, because a gray zone just says, it's between two areas and no person can take it. It's more yes, you could enter it. It's just so since this war is a war of ants where there's just 1 to 3 people attacking, you could enter a town and you could still have other and then the Ukrainians could send 1 or 2 people there, and the positions are intermixed and all that. Alrighty, now and also in this area, the Russians announced they took the town of Kharkovka, which makes sense. Maybe they haven't Kharkov is one of those things that's split in half by a how do you say it? By a river here. Now the thing about the river here is that so maybe on the western side of Kharkov they maybe haven't secured themselves, but I definitely think it's definitely possible that before we had a few weeks ago we had the Russians in Rekadup. I do think that maybe the Russians have maybe consolidated on the other side of the river here and took the eastern part of Kharkov, but who knows? Maybe they took the western part as well. But we haven't had any geolocation of that. Alright, now we're going to go to the Kupyansk direction. And in the Kupyansk direction, there's not been that much changes. We had one geolocation of, actually two, but we had one. We had another geolocation of the Russians being on, I think in the, on this like eastern part of Zaporizhia here. I still don't know why they claim this is under Ukrainian control. You could say it's a gray zone, but I do think that, I do kind of buy with what more on the pro-Russian source here, that, the town of Petropavlovka and Zaporizhia has been overrun by Russian forces, and they've taken it. So that geolocation, I think, also proves it. It's not in the central part of Zaporizhia. It's like there's like, I think it was like right here or something. But in any case, I do think that, again, the position is probably more like kind of along this highway almost. I mean, generally speaking. And, we've had multiple geolocation of the Russians being in Korolyivka and Poldonia. We have the Russians being in Pashana. Like a lot of sources are saying the Russians are even advancing to the south of Pashana, clearing these areas right here. I don't know why they claim this is like under Ukrainian control. I think this entire area is a giant gray zone. In any case, we shall see, and again, the eastern part, this eastern bank of Kupyansk is slowly but surely collapsing. Not collapsing, but slowly but surely being constricted. But it's very much a big gray zone. This is also another big area where there's a lot of intermixing. And then in the western part of Kupyansk, there was I think a geolocation of the Ukrainians storming an area, I think somewhere in this northern part here, where I forgot the exact one though, but they were storming and trying to clear Russians from here. So there's still Russian forces in the western part of Kupyansk, but again, it's one of those areas where it's very intermixed. They say they're still like the Russians there's like held up in some like of the biggest buildings here. But it's very hard to, how do you say it, they're having a very hard time holding on. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Ukrainians eventually clear out the western part. But again, it's actually a miracle the Russians have survived as long as they have, cut off and in the western part of Kupyansk. I kind of hate the people who are like talking about like, the people are saying Kupyansk almost fell, but look, they're making all this progress in the eastern part. The thing is, it wasn't about the eastern part that people are mad about or concerned about. If you're pro-Russian, it's the western bank. So, it's like, the western bank of Kupyansk for the Russians is still a bad news. So it's like, I don't know why people are like, oh my God, there's nothing going wrong. I hate people who are overly coping. That's, if you cope too much, you don't like actually learn from anything. But it's, again, that's there. There's been no changes in the Kharkov direction. But in the Sumy direction, there's actually been some pretty good changes for the Russians. There's been another incursion for the Russians. We talked about this, I think, earlier. But, we kind of, we talked about how the Russians took the town of Biloberza and Komarnovka. But this week, we had the Russians crossed the border, and we had the Russians in Kharkovka, this village right here, and it looks like also the town of Sidorovka here. Now, this is probably just another cross-border incursion where they're just trying to, split, pin Ukrainian forces, bring the Ukraine, force the Ukrainians to, send troops here. So we shall, I don't think they're going to, like, develop here because there's not really that much things to develop. I think they're just trying, these are very easy. They could take the border towns as much as they want, but, there's not really much else they can do. Again, there's like this other cross-border incursion right here. However, this week we had most mappers, we talked about how the Russians took the town of Pokrovka last week. However, this week most mappers are saying the Russians also took this huge forest to the south of Pokrovka here, and that they're actually now advancing towards Mykolaiv-Kyiivka here, right here. So very decent, very good news for the Russians expanding their foothold here. I'm also wouldn't be surprised if they have taken Popivka. I think they claimed that, but I don't know why this has not been colored yet. But in any case, I do think that, if the Russians want to, this is a very good area if the Russians want to, improve their positions. They just have to take the town of Razny here, and then also take the town of Novodnipropetrovsk and Toropilya here. And once they have something like this going on, then they'll have actually a pretty solid bridgehead here. And from here, the main goal is Krasnopilya. So if they take Krasnopilya, that actually would be a very good gain for the Russians. That would be very good. But I think these are just incursions to draw Ukrainian forces back to Sumy, away from the main forces in Donbass. And then also we have some Russian sources are saying they're now pushing south, taking some of these fields towards like the second line of the Khotin defense line, the second line of the Sumy defenses here, as I call it. Russians are also re-entering the town of Kondratovka here, and are trying to reassert control here. So, but we shall see how that develops. It looks, maybe there's a DRG activities, who knows, but we shall see. But that's the end of this video. The war is now 4 years old. We're now entering the 5th year of the war. Hope you guys enjoyed this this weekly war update. Subscribe to my channel if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates. Like this video, comment your thoughts, share this video around. I hope you guys are having a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.